So just once again, welcome to the first session, and Jumana pointed this out already, in this week's Knowledge Power Days compliance, with a focus on the war in Ukraine and the sanctions on Russia and Russian entities, and how this really drives the topic of business partner due diligence. My name's Christian Kellner. I'm leading the go-to-market team for the finance and risk portfolio, so the finance and risk solutions, both client and supplier-facing risks for Central Europe, i.e. DACH and Central and CEE. As the deck will be sent out, I think tomorrow, anytime, just reach out to me either through email or connect through LinkedIn. With regards to the agenda, it's pretty much one agenda point, which is the topic at hand. I think we should be done in around 30 minutes. What I'm gonna touch upon is the what's happening from a sanctions perspective, and what kind of regulatory restrictions we now saw the last couple of weeks and months since the Russian invasion in Ukraine. We're going to spend some time then on business partner due diligence, best practices, so what we've seen with regards to best practices on our client end in the market, with regards to how a standardized process, a standard onboarding process, a standardized due diligence process really can support in these grim times. And I think we then should just wrap it up and spend some minutes on takeaways. As this will be a 30-minute presentation, there's plenty of time for Q&A. I think this session is scheduled for 1 hour. So there should be plenty of time also to cover your questions. With that, let's start and dive deep into the topic already. So what we've seen in the last couple of weeks is really an unprecedented array of economic sanctions since the invasion of Ukraine by Russian forces end of February. What I put together here in this wheel is pretty much the consolidation and summary of what has happened since then, since major global economies, including the European Union, including the G7 states, who actually are meeting as we speak, in order as well to discuss, in addition, further potential economic sanctions. But since then, those countries, those economies have placed a tremendous amount of sanctions. And actually, when talking to compliance officers throughout the market space, in our client base, we have never experienced something similar, something like that. This is really unprecedented. This is new. This has significant scale and magnitude. And I think this is really shown as well through the numbers that we share here, and as well the topics that the sanctions are addressing. So in total, we talk about around about 1,200, actually more than 1,200 directly sanctioned entities and individuals. This is an incredible amount of people and businesses that are under direct sanctions from either of the economies mentioned here. We have specific territorial sanctions placed on the Donetsk Republic and Luhansk Republic, so the breakaway regions to the east of the Ukraine. And through our beneficial ownership and corporate structure database that we, from Dun & Bradstreet, take care of when linking entities and when linking individuals to entities, we can derive that out of those 1,200 entities that are under direct sanctions, we have over 50,000 entities who are linked to corporate structures. So any subsidiaries, ownership businesses that are linked from a business perspective to those directly sanctioned entities, we end up at a number of over 55,000 entities that are under indirect sanction, which may or may not have an impact of whom and how we are dealing with them. But nevertheless, I think it really shows how interconnected this whole piece is. We see sanctions in the transport area. We see specifically now out of our very own business that we as well are limited in what we are able to do and what we can provide as a service to all of you as being our clients with regards to prohibition on trade rating services. So we, as well as of course other credit rating agencies and credit rating providers, are not allowed to rate directly sanctioned entities in Russia, and you've seen the communication on that probably as well already some weeks ago. We have bans in the investment area. We have sectoral trade restrictions, so restrictions on importing and exporting goods, and we'll touch upon this in a couple of minutes in more detail. We have financial sector restrictions in place. So it's really, it's all over the place, and it puts a lot of strain on us, on all of you as compliance officers, as compliance representatives in your businesses, as procurement officers, as sales officers, as CEOs, because this is not only the vast amount of sanctions in place, but it's also the timing. Looking back into what happened now, specifically from a European Union perspective, just to give this into some perspective, set this into perspective, let's look at the timing. So even before the invasion happened, February 23rd, we saw the first package in place. And then it happened every 2, 3, 4, 5 days until we saw a little bit of a decline in speed. Then end of March, when also the topics were increasingly sensitive and potentially the different European Union member states weren't as easy to align on certain topics as in the beginning, but we saw a vast amount happening in quite short amount of time. This will be sent out then in package then tomorrow, so I won't go into too much into details, as we are as well trying to look at this from another perspective with regards to not specifically which areas are affected. And this is now covered in the slide with regards to which areas of interest do we actually see. And it all starts, and to explain this a bit, the 1,000 entities and individuals in the first column and the 36,000 indirectly sanctioned entities, so those are covered through European sanctions. What I showed some 2 slides earlier were the overall sanctions. So we've seen over 1,000 individuals and entities on EU sanctions, with ending up in around 36,000 indirectly sanctioned entities. And this pretty much involves anything from asset freeze, travel bans, but more importantly, a ban of directly or indirectly providing funds and assets. So as well, deriving from that piece, actually the most critical sanctions and implications for European businesses in actually not doing business with those entities, and specifically looking to individuals not doing business with entities that are under control through beneficial ownership linked to those individuals. We saw a plethora of financial sanctions with restrictions on accessing the EU capital market, a ban of transactions with the central banks in both Belarus and Russia. You've all heard of the exclusion from the SWIFT banking system for a couple of banks, not all of them, but there's additional, actually there were additional banks as well sanctioned on that piece 2 weeks ago. Ban of public investments, ban of credit rating services, we touched upon this already. We saw sectoral trade restrictions, and this is, I think, what specifically, of course, any manufacturer would be specifically interested in with regards to restrictions in, of course, as well services, with restrictions in providing goods and technologies in aviation, in seafaring, spacefaring technology, import-export restrictions in the energy sector, in commodity trading, in providing luxury goods. And of course, a ban on exporting dual-use goods and goods technologies that could potentially support adding to the military capabilities of the Russian Federation. Specifically from a territorial sanctions perspective, there's a trade ban on goods, ban on tourism services, and as well additional investment restrictions in place. What this now would mean, and I think this is also how the majority of businesses usually tackles those issues, tackles those sanctions that are in place, is that there are sanctions in place. We need to react on that. We need to take action, whatever that action may be, terminate the business, apply higher risk profile on that, extend the approval flow for it, but take an action and then monitor the whole situation and of course further developments. What needs to happen is, of course, we need to understand, and clients need to understand the overall exposure to what's happening, what kind of service, what kind of partnership, what kind of business relationship is in place. How does the ownership structure look like of my business partner, of my supplier, of my client? Do a sanction screening, do a sanction check, do a risk analysis, do a mitigation plan, and then of course stay on top of it. But I think what's maybe a bit misleading in that picture is that this shouldn't be a step-by-step approach. This should be a looping piece. We don't want to react all the time on what's happening, not specifically in Russia, but I think we've seen lots of disruptional events happening over the last couple of years with COVID, with the Suez Canal piece, and that we actually need to rethink how we work with business relationships and how we end up being reactive and going to a more proactive way of doing business, and of course, primarily doing a proactive way of doing due diligence. Because, and I think this slide, for all of you who have seen our Bradstreet presentations, I think this is looks familiar. It's not about fear mongering. It's not about showing the tip of the iceberg and showing the threat that sits beneath. But what I want to convey with this is really the idea that it's just not data on suppliers and clients and business partners and third parties. It's about the poor insight that is connected with having disconnected business partner data hubs and the limited visibility that of course results out of that when there's no clear picture on connected data points to your supplier and client data. So what's the regulatory risk connected with the supplier or a given third party in any high risk territory on a global scale? What's the beneficial ownership structure look like? How does that beneficial ownership structure change over time? Do we have a low risk entity involved that potentially will be a high risk entity tomorrow, either from a change in the beneficial ownership structure or through a change by regulation? What's the cyber risk attached to your clients and business partners? Is there any fraudulent activity happening? What's any shipping data relevant changes? So there's lots of pieces connected to your business partners, and hence it's really time to rethink how we can do a more proactive approach towards mitigating risks. Because one thing I think is for sure, we cannot eliminate risks. We can only try to mitigate them as best as possible. And this starts, of course, with a proper assessment process, top right corner. It's about developing a risk-based assessment process to identify specific risks that could impact the productivity, that could impact your productivity. And the first step really is around that, to understand who is connected to my business partner, who is the beneficial owner, what are the corporate links to my business partner, and then really support this with a strong due diligence process beneath. And this taking into account any financial data that is relevant for the business relationship. Of course, you want to onboard, and the next step, potentially stable clients and suppliers, not unstable ones. You want to maybe address as well cyber risk attached to your business partner, or specifically now, because this is a trending piece as well, also from a European regulatory perspective, any ESG risks attached to your business partner. This leading really much into the whole onboarding process. How are those companies that you want to make part of your portfolio, to your client supply portfolio, how do they potentially impact your business? How do they impact your go-to-market activities? And what is the risk profile attached to those that really matter to you? Because that's the first step, is really something you or we need to monitor in a way that goes a step further than what we've been used to, doing an initial check when onboarding a new client or supplier, and then maybe do a reassessment depending on the actual risk profile or risk attached to this business partner once a year, every 2 years, every 3 months, be the red, green, or yellow risk attached to it, and really go from that to what we like to call, and also what's I think quite common as well in some areas, like what we call the perpetual KYC piece, or the perpetual KYB piece. So doing continuous risk assessment attached to your client, and this risk, of course, being directly connected risk within a given entity. So any risk attached to maybe the financial strength of your business partner, but as well the overarching maybe macroeconomic risks that are attached to a given territory or segment or industry, etc. And then really go from that to manage the portfolio. Stress test alternatives to your supply chain. Are the suppliers in different markets that may be kind of this? Can you go from offshoring activities to moving them actually onshore? Finding alternative suppliers. So really go from a reactive way of needing to address a threat to your business to moving into a proactive way of actually managing the risks and also managing the opportunities, specifically in the compliance space. Compliance officers are seen as business enabler, or they should be seen in some countries, in some businesses. There's like a shift happening, right? From someone that says no to business, but someone who should say yes to business, but of course raise the hand if there's risk attached to it. And really take care in this overall process to vet all your counterparties, monitor and manage the risk when risks change. And what we've seen over the last couple of years, that of course is something that is continuously happening, and it's happening at speed and at increased level of speed. What this might mean, now in maybe more hands-on, from a hands-on perspective, specifically with regards to having a standardized onboarding process in place, is really have a clear understanding of who is your business partner. One thing I want to highlight here really is just, once again, the DUNS number. When we want to uniquely identify our business partner on a global scale. And I put together here an example of a made-up Russian gas company, where we may have different data points depending on source, which is to the left of your screen. There's maybe a source like a contact from a conference, source one, a name, someone we know. We have another source, maybe that's the ERP source, where we have like a client called Rasgas with a post office address in Moscow. And then maybe there's a third source, out of a CRM, out of activities in the marketing activities. By applying a DUNS number, a global unique identifier to them, we can consolidate that. We can identify that those three entities are actually connected, that this person to the bottom out of source one is actually the CEO of that company, and that both source two and source three are the very same company, just with one's post office address and the other one being a physical address. So having that consolidated profile in place with a DUNS assigned to it, with names standardized and rationalized, and with proper categorization of addresses, really helps in supporting the total onboarding flow. Second piece is how we actually link entities together. And there's two approaches to that, actually two approaches that we at Bradstreet are doing. The first one, the classic top-down corporate linkage. You might remember from I think the third slide is how many entities we see sitting in the very same corporate structure, the very same corporate tree, then directly sanctioned entities, now specifically in Russia. So this is the classic majority-owned view on how to connect businesses, how to actually build and maintain by continuous and proper assessment corporate structures on a global scale. The second one, bottom up. We want to understand who is my business partner, so who is owning my business partner, and those could be entities, those could be businesses, those could be individuals. Specifically from an individual beneficial ownership perspective, of course, individuals are the primary focal point, but nevertheless, I want to understand how does this tree build up from bottom up. Just to give you two examples of this. First one being a classic corporate linkage tree. So we start with any given DUNS number that we maybe have identified through the identification process as well, or it could be a DUNS number that as well sits already in your systems. And then to really derive the whole global ultimate business on the very top, and then drill down on the specific subsidiary trees that sit below this global ultimate. All it needs for that is one DUNS number that pretty much builds up the whole tree, then moving forward and allows a complete view on the majority owned tree out from that single piece of information, your business partner being it the client or supplier. The second view, make this one really concrete, and I know this is a bit confusing at first sight, but it really shows what this is doing. It starts with the DUNS as well, so the Rosneft Holding Limited at the very bottom, and allows to understand who is owning that company from both business and individual perspective. And what shows as well is, for instance, that we might have loop relationships in there. So relationships that try to, now I'm missing the English word, try to make it a bit more unclear who's actually owning the entity. So you see a loop relationship to the left of the screen, for instance. To the right, we see a plethora of individuals that are directly connected to the parent company of our business partner in focus. So individuals that might end up or might have ended up on any sanction list. So what this does, it provides all the entities regardless if it's a business or an individual, from that focal point, from the business partner of yours, to the last identifiable link that we have throughout our systems. And this pretty much feeds into what we would like to call like a best practice business partner assessment structure. How are we proposing when talking to clients, but also being fed back best practices and ideas and best practices out of our client base, how supplier onboarding processes are structured. And this starts at the very first step, the investigation. So I think the step that we haven't covered up until now is, of course, we want to identify a new supplier. And linking back to what we would like to call managing your portfolio. Of course, this includes identifying alternative suppliers. Moving into specifically the supplier onboarding process piece, anything about supply identification. So we want to get hold, depending on your supplier policy, master data on your supplier, activity status, what kind of industry is this supplier in, what's the hierarchy connected to the supplier, who are the principals involved in this, etc., etc. Next step, classic risk assessment. What are my risks attached to that specific supplier? This could be solvency risk, like score, rating, paydex. This could be country risk attached to it. This could be any risk that is not directly connected with any compliance and regulatory restrictions perspective, which is covered in the next step. So depending on your compliance policy, depending on how you are dealing with suppliers and business partners, and what kind of standards you are including in your business partner, in managing your business partners, what ethical guidelines you are applying to your business. This is really covered in that piece. So any ownership links that are potential red flag, any screening links that are potential red flag, from sanctions to any PEP links, so politically exposed persons, any adverse media. So what kind of image? So what I'm supposed to do from a legal perspective, but as well covering in that piece, what is my ethical standard? What's my ethical approach towards doing business? And then really have like an ongoing flow in place from an onboard supplier, feeding into the whole supplier base, into my supplier portfolio, and do continuous monitoring. And this, of course, could be like a regular assessment depending on the risk attached to a given supplier. But as we have already talked about, and it's what we've seen as well in the market space happening, like moving into a more continuous monitoring approach, like into a perpetual KYC piece, like a perpetual KYB approach. And just to give you an idea of how flexible this approach usually is, or this process could be, and I know this is not part of today's topic, but just to also address this as well, we have a new data point, which might be an ESG data point, might be an ESG ranking, an ESG figure. We could actually link this simple data point to any given step in that process, from investigating new suppliers, so maybe excluding any potential suppliers not adhering to a certain ESG standard or requirement that you as a company have put forward, to the risk assessment. So include ESG risks as well in your risk assessment with ready ESG data that is actionable upon. Feed it into the compliance check, and then really follow up as well on the ESG development, and then use the ESG ranking as well in the continuous monitoring piece. So this is like a flexible way that we would like to make you familiar with. I know there are companies out there who are doing it already like this, but this really helps, in getting out of a situation where we need to react to threats from a pure tactical perspective into a more strategic approach. Like tactical, we have a new threat out there. There's a new sanction package being put forward by the European Union. Maybe there's not the one coming up in 3 days, but right now we have to deal with this new package right away. We need to check the business partner master data. We need to check maybe ownership links. We need to check the exposure to sanctions. And of course, assess properly, because being actually identifying a hit on a sanction list doesn't mean that we would need to immediately stop business with a given entity. But this needs further investigation. It could mean that there's just, if it's not regulated directly, it could mean that we would just need to assess it also from an ethical standpoint, right? Do I want to continue doing business with an entity that has certain links in certain high-risk areas, or maybe indirectly sanctioned by the sanctions piece towards Russia? What would like to put forward, from a more strategic perspective, going away from the reactive way of doing business and reacting to changes on an individual company level, but as well from a macroeconomic level, from a compliance level, from a sanction level, is really try to establish a strong standardized onboarding process that really takes into account both what's happening on a global scale with regards to risk and risk exposure, but also the individual risk appetite, right, that sits within your organization. Also what you anticipate from a regulatory perspective to happen, linking back to what happened now with Ukraine and Russia. There's been talks around, banning oil imports for quite some time. This was of course pretty obvious, but there's other pieces that I think we can anticipate to happen at some point in the future. And if we have a standardized onboarding process in place, it's easier to integrate those data points already now and make this an actionable item moving forward without needing to react every single time on new events that are happening globally. And also it allows for inclusion of ethical standards, right? And this being any ethical standards with regards to ESG, as well as mentioned already in the proposed or actually best practice supply onboarding process, the slide earlier. And while doing that, while planning ahead, identify alternative suppliers, bring them ashore if possible. I know this is not possible in every single step, and every single environment. But this is of course a risk mitigation piece that I think in an environment that we currently see and live in is something we need to really consider moving forward. And that's it. And I think we are already through it and ended up in the Q&A.
Mm-hmm.
Romana,
Yes,
are there any questions?
Yes, there are already several questions. The first one is Dun & Bradstreet still able to provide company and UBO information on entities in Russia and Belarus? We were already wondering why we couldn't retrieve information anymore. You mentioned a notification.